On the front page of today's New York Daily News is a heartbreaking picture of retired NYPD Sergeant Raymond Moore. He is saluting his slain son, his flesh and blood, his pride, his 25-year-old son, Brian. Saluting him for living a life of valor and paying the ultimate sacrifice because of a thug, an ex-con, a speck of dirt under our shoes. Demetrius Blackwell was 35 years old. He's accused of shooting Officer Moore in the face Saturday night. Of course, the guy has a rap sheet as long as your arm. He is just a slug. And this little creep extinguished the life of a beloved, popular, funny, terrific young man named Brian Moore. And when we keep seeing stories of how bad the police are, when the President of the United States disparages police officers, you're going to have to forgive me, but I get very, very angry. I have been doing my best to be objective regarding the words of the President of the United States following the Baltimore riots. I'm one of the few who has not tried to politicize the death of Freddie Gray. I'm not going to blame Democrat policies for a guy who died or was severely injured, allegedly while in police custody. And that led to riots. I'm not going to blame Democrats. I'm not going to defend Republicans. I'm not going to blame Republicans. I don't think it's a Democrat-Republican problem. It's a human problem that ought to be way deeper than our political differences. And I have, as you know, distanced myself from politicizing Baltimore. I'm not trying to politicize Baltimore or politicize the death of Freddie Gray or politicize the death of Officer Brian Moore. But I can't get the image of this fresh-faced 25-year-old. All of my sons are older than this police officer who was shot in the face when he confronted a bad guy on the streets of New York and said, "What are you doing fiddling there with your waistband? Do you have something in your waistband?" And the guy said, "You bet I do." And he pulled out a gun and fired and shot this man in the face. And he fought for his life for a couple of days in the hospital with his heartbroken family at his bedside. This is a police officer who is paid to confront this vermin on our streets. And we've got a president who sees fit to say this. Now, let's point out, just by way of identification, the man who is now in jail, charged with shooting this police officer in the face, assassinating him, happens to be a black man. The police officer who was shot in the face happened to have been a white man. And there won't be any rallies or marches or protests for Brian Moore. There'll be a procession with cops saluting him. We'll light candles for Brian Moore. No one's going to take to the streets for a cop gunned down for doing his job. And it's with that backdrop that I have to play this audio clip so you can understand the source of my anger. Here's cut number 12. This is audio courtesy of C-SPAN. This is Barack Obama relaunching an organization called My Brother's Keeper. It's a nonprofit, and it addresses the opportunity gap for young men of color. Listen, as all of New York seemingly mourns the death of this young man, Officer Brian Moore, listen to what the President of the United States said about police in the United States.
Those opportunity gaps begin early, often at birth, and they compound over time, becoming harder and harder to bridge, making too many young men and women feel like no matter how hard they try, they may never achieve their dreams. And that sense of unfairness, powerlessness, of people not hearing their voices, that's helped fuel some of the protests that we've seen in places like Baltimore and Ferguson and right here in New York. The catalysts of those protests were the tragic deaths of young men and a feeling that law is not always applied evenly in this country. In too many places in this country, black boys and black men, Latino boys, Latino men, they experience being treated differently by law enforcement.
I wonder what the family of Brian Moore has to say about that. Brian Moore, who will be laid to rest this week, who will be eulogized, who will be given a funeral, who will be lowered into the ground at 25 years old. I wonder if he disproportionately targeted blacks. I wonder if Brian Moore's father, retired NYPD Sergeant Raymond Moore, standing there yesterday in the sunshine as his son's body was being driven in the slow procession in an ambulance, saluting his son, the heartbreak all over his face of losing his son to the streets, to some twisted, evil monster who had no regard for human life. I wonder if Sergeant Moore disproportionately targeted black men. What if he just went out and said, let's just go mess with some black guys today because we're racists and we want to mess around with them? No, I would submit that today's police officer bends over backwards and, dare I say, even hesitates before they could be possibly accused of doing something that would earn the wrath of rioters and protesters and looters and, yes, the President of the United States. No cop wants to be accused of what Obama just accused America's cops of doing. And the cops I know, the sergeants, the patrol officers, the sheriff's deputies, the men and women who never know if they'll encounter a Demetrius Blackwell someday. The men and women who we pay to go into the dark, dangerous alleys and the streets and the abandoned buildings and the projects and the mansions where a man and a woman are in a violent fight to the death. These men and women continue to be disparaged by our commander-in-chief.